The world of geopolitics is complex. It encapsulates foreign policy, defense, trade, and culture. These can have ripples that can be felt all around the planet.
With that, we welcome you to The Global Detail, a podcast where we go beyond borders and behind the headlines to stories that impact the world.
Our goal is to peel the onion and explore the various diverse layers through riveting interviews with experts and stalwarts. I'm Akshobh Giridharadas.
And co-piloting this journey, I'm Brendan Duke. Let's get into it. Hyphenated identities can often be tricky. On one hand, a person has a foot in two different worlds, but the challenge is balancing those identities into one whole self. The Indian American diaspora is one of the most influential in America. Despite being only 1% of the American population, the Indian American identity has been synonymized with STEM professionals, particularly doctors and engineers. Also common are spelling bee champions and soft power in the form of cuisine, cinema, and the arts. In politics, along with several members of Congress, there is Vice President Kamala Harris, whose mother is from India. So how did the story of the Indian American identity evolve? Milan Vaishnav is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, one of Washington, D.C.'s leading think tanks. Milan's research focuses on India's political economy, governance, state capacity, distributive politics, and electoral behavior. Milan is also the author of When Crime Pays: Money and Muscle in Indian Politics, which received accolades as the best nonfiction book on contemporary India published in 2017. He is also familiar with the world of podcasting, being the host of the weekly show Grand Tamasha at Carnegie, which interviews some of the biggest South Asian intellectuals. Milan has done exhaustive studies on the Indian American diaspora, and Akshobh Giridharadas spoke to him at the height of the pandemic on the changes and reinvention of the Indian American identity and the dialogue around the diaspora.
Well, Milan, thank you so much for joining us here today, and just this conversation on embracing the hyphen, the Indian American identity. Just thinking about my own story, I came from a family where we sort of did the reverse. Most Indian families may have one family in America and everyone back in India. But in my case, we were the only family in India and everyone was in the United States. And I always quipped that there was this notion that when we were growing up in India, our education system was ABC, H1B. That is, you work really hard in school, only do the STEM. You can flirt with the humanities, but you got to marry the STEM, intellectual arranged marriages. And you would come for a good grad school or undergrad in the US in one of the STEM fields. If not doctor, then or job on Wall Street or Silicon Valley would open up. You'd get that H1B going that will lead to a green card and then a pathway to citizenship. And your children born here never need to know what the get out of jail card look like. And largely that was the notion. Of course, things like the financial crisis happened, but would you say that's still the pattern today? What is the Indian dream the American dream? Or would you say 4 years of the Trump administration and regressive immigration laws or lack of immigration reform have sort of dissuaded that path?
Thanks. Well, first of all, it's great to be here and thanks for having me. I think, look, there are a couple of facts about this community that always grab my attention, right? The fact that between 2000 and 2018, the size of the Indian origin population has grown by about 150%. The fact that, this is something I didn't know, and that Devesh Kapoor, who's one of my collaborators, who's literally written the book on this with co-authors called The Other 1%, which is a kind of definitive look at Indians in America, is that 2/3 of all people of Indian origin sort of came after the year 2000, right? Which is just kind of mind-boggling when you think about that shift. So yes, obviously there were fluctuations of the Trump era, but I I think we will look back on that period, hopefully, as an aberration, as we see a return to a more sane and balanced kind of, visa regime. There's obviously a lot of variation within this community. It's hard to speak of it as a kind of generalizable, kind of monolithic entity. And so not everybody is the stereotypical, son of doctors or daughter of engineers or H-1B visa holder. One of the things that recent data from the Department of Homeland Security points out is that India actually constitutes the fifth largest Indian Americans, I should say, constitute the fifth largest community of undocumented immigrants in this country, right? So I think a focus on the kind of averages, or if you look at median income, median education, both of which are off the charts, sometimes can obscure more than they reveal.
Well, Milan, that's really interesting stats. I want to take you to this article that I read in The Atlantic. Obviously, it references your hometown of Houston, Texas. I understand Washington, D.C., and now Geneva is home. It referred to how the Indian American community became the model minority. And I just want you to talk about this term model minority and how it got codified with the Indian American or Desi American community as we've come to know. And I think as an academic, and you'd also say there's a problem with this term model minority because it's juxtaposed against another minority which is not model based on, drawing polar opposites. So how did the Indian American community just get this term model minority? Is it largely because of the ubiquity of the Dr. Patel, the spelling bee champion, the Indian CEO, and the vast diaspora that's involved in STEM professions? So just walk me through this term model minority.
I mean, I think, again, if you step back and you look at averages, right? I mean, you see that the median household income for Indian Americans is double the national average. The same is true of educational attainment, very low rates of divorce, relatively low rates of poverty, tremendous achievements in the public eye, right? From Hollywood to the world of CEOs to Silicon Valley to business. I mean, literally, almost every segment you can think about, or every sector. And so, I think many people sort of look at that and say, this is what an immigrant community should be. These are hardworking people who have come here and kind of multiplied their success, and they kind of stay out of trouble, and they don't raise their heads. They just keep their head down and do good work and, provide for their family. And, I do think it's obviously a very problematic stereotype, not because successes shouldn't be heralded, but I think sometimes implicit in this is an idea that, you keep your head down, you shut up, you don't engage in political or social activism, you kind of quote unquote sort of stay in your lane, and that this is somehow the same path that all other immigrants should follow. And, all other immigrant communities don't look the same. I mean, one thing we know is by and large, there was a real selection effect in terms of which Indians decided to migrate to the United States, right? They tended to be upper caste. They tended to be better educated. They tended to be fluent or at least conversant in English. And, they had a lot of privilege in some sense. Now, over the years, that image has changed in that we've seen a much greater diversity of Indians in terms of, all characteristics, religion, caste, geography, education, come to the United States. But I think that we have one very particular image that's stuck in time. And it's often reflected in the kind of my parents' generation, right? My parents immigrated from India in the late 1960s and have been here for the past 50 years. But it ignores that there was a generation which came before them, right? Largely Punjabis who settled in California and places like that. And also ignores the fact that, there's been a huge spike which came after them, the so-called IT generation, right? People who have been in the United States for a much shorter period of time, many of whom were non-citizens, right? I mean, I think we forget that, 4.1, 4.2 million people of Indian origin live in the United States, but only about 2.6, 2.7 are U.S. citizens, right? So a pretty large, in a relative sense, pretty large section of non-citizens.
Yeah, I remember the famous story of Bharat Singh Thind, I think the first Indian American to be naturalized and saw his citizenship revoked. Just thinking about what you highlighted here, Milan, when India had existed at a different time in the 60s and the 70s in a very socialist licensed Raj era. So when your parents came or my uncles came and a plethora of Indian diaspora came post the Naturalization Act in 64, 65, that paved the way. But even when they came in, India was at a different time. So there was still these archaic stereotypes of India being this land of depraved poverty, this place where fakirs slept on nails, and the cliches that we hear about going to your school on elephants and land of snake charmers, very regressive stereotypes that probably were flowing in the non-political correct era. And today there's a different notion. So while it might be stereotypical, as I said, to see that Indian doctor, the spelling bee champion, and that math nerd or that character at Big Bang Theory or Silicon Valley, is it still a win given that there's a shift in negative stereotypes to positive stereotypes? I mean, can we still juxtapose the phrase positive stereotypes?
Yes and no, right? I mean, I think it's not a win in that it kind of homogenizes or essentializes the community. And, one thing we've learned from the recent uptick in violence against Asian Americans, primarily of East Asian origin, is that despite whatever professional, educational, and other success you might have, that doesn't mean that you're somehow inoculated or sheltered from division, polarization, discrimination, contestation, and so on and so forth, right? So I think that's the downside. I think the upside is that the people-to-people relationship has certainly been one of the key components of the broader U.S.-India partnership. And I think that this works at a very human level. I mean, I remember, it must have been 7 or 8 years ago, I had gone to an event. It was on the sidelines of the National Governors Association meeting, which was being held in Washington. And there was a reception thrown by the CII, the Confederation of Indian Industry, and an Indian corporate, which is quite active in the United States. And they had 4 or 5 governors of pretty big states come to this reception to kind of celebrate U.S.-India ties, Indian Americans. And that was a real eye-opener for me, right? I mean, here are people who are packed for this weekend of kind of glitz and glamour and lobbying and schmoozing, and decide to devote some time to this because they feel it's important. But each governor who came up in talking about why India was important, it came from a specific constituent of theirs. I know so-and-so who is an entrepreneur in the state of Illinois, and thanks to him, I went on a trade delegation to India in 2009, and I was able my eyes were open to, the amazing qualities that India has, and that was a kind of inflection point. Similar stories about people who had staff members, right, who were chiefs of staff or legislative directors who were Indian American, right, and that sort of had an influence on them. So I do think that people to people stuff, it's easy to kind of say, that soft stuff, it doesn't really matter. But I do think at a very human level, right, I do think it has an impact on people. And I think that, I think it's safe to say that the Indian American community, by and large, has been a very important bridge builder between the United States and India. And that has, in part, really bolster this relationship. And I think we see this during COVID too, right? I mean, I had watched very closely sitting in Washington how the U.S. administration was handling the COVID epidemic. And I think it's fair to say they were very slow off the mark, right? They didn't quite understand the gravity of the crisis. And I think there were many Indian Americans who took to social media, who are campaign contributors, who contacted the people they'd given money to, who called their friends in the administration at the White House and the State Department and said, like, this is a 5-alarm fire and you've got to start paying attention. Now, I think the U.S. government certainly would have come to that conclusion eventually, but did that intervention by the community quicken the pace? I think undoubtedly yes.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the governors, and that's a great aspect, because I think the first, maybe obviously a little before that, but obviously the prominence of Indian Americans in politics came when you saw Bobby Jindal and Nikki Haley, two very unlikely heroes in the Indian American community, because given some of their views may not align with the majority of Indian Americans, which more or less aligned Democrats. I want to get your opinion on that in a bit, but Nikki Haley said something which kind of is very interesting. It's very brief, but it actually more profound. She says, to kind of sum up, why Indians were able to assimilate so well in the United States was, she said in a single line, mostly we were just good at being Americans. Milan, as someone who, straddled two worlds and, growing up Indian at home, I'm guessing in Texas, but American outside, with PB&J sandwiches in school. And there's always this sense of deracination that I can understand from my family and my friends who grew up in these two worlds. So unpack that for me.
Well, look, I don't think what Nikki Haley said is that uncharacteristic of immigrant communities as a whole, right? I do think that there is a general tendency for the first generation to come and to be very concerned about kind of, assimilation, right? They want to make sure that their kids are treated like everyone else. They want to make sure that their kids speak English perfectly, right? They want to make sure that they excel. And in the case of the Indian American community, it really wasn't that big. So in terms of collective mobilization, social action, political action, of course, there were plenty of examples one could point to, but I think it's really only until recently that we've kind of hit a critical mass where we've started to see sort of more of that, right? So the focus really wasn't on bringing attention to yourself and your identity. It was more trying to create a life and a career and a family for yourself in this kind of new and distant place. And I think you could say the same about Italian Americans or Irish Americans. I think that's a kind of natural transition. The one thing which was quite interesting from our most recent report, and we can talk about the survey that went into this, is we asked a randomly selected group of Indian Americans around the country, how do you self-identify, in terms of your kind of ethnic identity? And just about 4 in 10 said Indian American, which surprised me. I thought the number would be much higher. But fully a quarter to 25% said just Indian, right? Which I think, again, when you consider the non-citizen population, the non-U.S. citizen population is quite high. Probably a lot of these people may not have adopted a kind of hyphenated existence. But, there's 6% who say, I just want to be known as American, right? And that's exactly what Bobby Jindal said, the former Louisiana governor, when he ran for president several years ago. And it created a lot of waves in the community, a lot of backlash, frankly, right? He said, I don't want to be known as a hyphenated anything. I'm just an American. So I don't think that it's a monolith. I do think that there's also variation within the community in terms of people who embrace the Indian identity, right? So, talking to friends in the Sikh community, right? Many of them prefer the term South Asian, right? They view themselves often as a community that was split between two countries, India and Pakistan, and they've had difficult relations in some ways with both of those countries, right? Indian American Muslims, right? Many more of them are inclined to identify as South Asian American. And I think that might signal the fact, and this is just a hypothesis, that they relate to Pakistani Americans and Bangladeshi Americans maybe to the same extent, maybe even more than fellow Indian Americans because of a common religious identity, right? So I think, so these surface level impressions that we have, I think only take us so far, right? And I think that's one of the great things about being in America is, you have these multiple, sometimes overlapping, cross-cutting identities, right? That's a issue of personal choice.
Well, Milan, great point on cross-cutting identities. I think now to everyone's favorite topic, political season. And it's always fun to see how, Indian Americans are now, because there's so much size and number, they are a political representative, right? And most of the statistics still reveals overwhelming data that shows Indian Americans vote Democrat or tend to vote Democrat. I spoke with, I've heard Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy speak, where he said, he calls the 4, now 5 Indian Americans in Congress as the Samosa Caucus, which 1% of the American population is Indian American and 1% of Congress is Indian American. But is it on the identity of politics? While Indian Americans are not a monolith, right? Far from it, different communities. It's hard to even think that any people vote on a single issue. But why is it overwhelmingly that Indian Americans vote Democrat? What is your research shown? Partly is it because the Republican Party has gone so far to the right that some would say Reagan won't get elected today. It looks very unidentifiable in the Trumpian world. And do we think that, that the Democrat Party at least projects a more inclusive diversity outlook? Is that why you think that Indian Americans vote Democrat? Because some would talk about Indian Americans being some of the highest earners, this model minority, and the Republican fiscal conservatism would apply to them. And to be fair, there are a significant amount of Indian Americans that do identify Republican. And you're from Texas, and we've seen large coalitions do identify as Republican. But why is it sort of an 80-20, almost Pareto principle of Indian Americans being Democrat more than Republican?
Yeah, so this was a big motivating factor behind this survey, right? So I should just say we meaning myself, Dinesh Kapoor, Johns Hopkins Heiss, and Sumitra Badrunathan, who is at Oxford, was previously at University of Pennsylvania, worked with the data and analytics from YouGov to field a survey of 1,200 Indian Americans. Using YouGov, for some of you might know, has an online panel of respondents. It's around 2 million strong. So we used that to create a representative sample of Indian Americans across the country, representative of age, gender, region, education, and so on and so forth. And there was a big narrative propagated by many in the media heading into the 2020 U.S. election that Indian Americans who had traditionally been democratically inclined were going to defect to the Republican Party for 2 reasons. One is that Donald Trump had actually been a good steward of U.S.-India relations, and he and Modi had a kind of bromance, or had a certain kind of rapport or partnership. And the second is that there was a fear amongst Indian Americans that the Biden-Harris administration would scrutinize to a greater extent some of India's internal domestic politics in ways that might be uncomfortable. And so I think there were a lot of people sort of speculating, and we just sort of wanted to see, what does the data show? And what we found is that 72% of registered Indian American voters intended to vote. This was a survey done in September, so before the election, intended to vote for Joe Biden. Just 22% indicated that they would vote for Donald Trump. That is largely in keeping with how the community has voted in the past, to be honest with you. The Republican numbers maybe are slightly higher. But what's interesting is when you think about this in a comparative context, and you array Indian Americans against other communities, Blacks, whites, Hispanics, other Asians, African Americans are perhaps the most loyal constituency for the Democratic Party. About 80% of them roughly voted for Joe Biden. But then Indian Americans are kind of in there at second, right? Above Hispanics, certainly above other Asians, and above the white population, which Donald Trump won. And so, I think that they once again proved their affinity towards the Democratic Party. Now, the question is why, right? You might think, given their elevated income, they might be inclined to vote Republican for purely fiscal, tax, economic reasons. And so we sort of asked this question, to say like, okay, if you don't identify with the Republican Party, what is it about the party that you don't like, right? Or what is it that makes you vote in another way? And the number one response was that we believe that the current Republican Party is intolerant of minorities. And the number two response is that we thought it's too influenced by Christian evangelicalism. And so I think for many Indian Americans, the impression of the Republican Party is a party that is nativist, xenophobic, kind of not so friendly to minorities, including minorities, quote unquote, who have done well, like the Indian population in the United States.
Yeah, Milan, just sticking with that topic about the Indian American community and their political engagement, we've seen, since Prime Minister Modi came to power, there's sort of been an inflection point, particularly that September in 2014, Madison Square Garden, unprecedented to see, 20,000 people in a packed house, one of America's most iconic venues for an Indian prime minister. And then you saw that even in with Howdy Modi in Texas, the state that you come from, and the sequel, Namaste Trump in Ahmedabad. There's something about Gujarati and Texas connection here. But what I find fascinating is the early diaspora that came, the 70s, 80s, and maybe up to the 90s, there was perhaps a sense of deracination from India, and perhaps there was a sense of community that wanted to keep India far away and leave that India behind, which is why the phrase ABCD got codified, American born confused Desi, or the phrase coconut sometimes, brown outside, white inside. But now we've seen there's a lot more engagement with India, or the alacrity to identify more as Indian, along with the hyphen of Indian American. Is this a sense that you find that perhaps there is a new India on the horizon, one that's economically more confident, that people want to identify with more, as compared to some of the more pejorative stereotypes of the India that their forefathers came from, or the India that they knew?
Well, it's hard to know about trends over time, right? Because we don't have the baseline data to compare things to. But what we do know from our study is that a large majority of foreign-born Indian Americans, so those typically born in India who migrated to the United States, feel extremely or very connected to what's happening in India. But smaller shares of those born in the U.S. feel the same way, which again I think is kind of natural, right? You expect as the generations pass that some of that connectivity naturally starts to erode or lessen. But having said that, when you look at talking to friends and family in India, eating Indian food, watching Indian movies or television on Netflix or Amazon Prime, enjoying some aspect of Indian art and culture, those things are actually not that dissimilar for foreign-born versus U.S.-born Indian Americans, right? As you'd expect, they tend to be higher rates of engagement for foreign-born, but 2/3 of Indian Americans born in the United States say they've eaten Indian food in the last month, right? I mean, which I feel like is like one indicator of some connection, right? There are certainly more Indian Americans born in the United States who are second generation like me, who are not as up to date on domestic developments, what's happening with politics, who the relevant players are. We certainly see that to be the case. But I think both in terms of personal connection, cultural connections, and then just following the sort of news, I think the ties that bind the diaspora back home to the motherland, as it were, are reasonably sort of resilient. Now, that doesn't mean that they agree on the outlook for what's happening in India, right? So if one of the interesting questions we wanted to really study is, how do people see Modi? Here he's a sort of polarizing figure. People have very strong opinions about him, right? Positive or negative. the diaspora always has been perceived to be a huge Modi kind of booster in America. And what we find is that, yes, Modi is popular, and he has a greater than 50% approval rating for the diaspora. But there are differences, right? People who are born in the United States are less bullish on him. People who are religious minorities or non-Hindus are less bullish on him. And people who come from certain parts of India are less bullish on him. So those who come from the east and the south, for instance, compared to those who come from the west, states like Gujarat, Maharashtra, or the north or central India. So, I think we have in our mind 55,000 shouting Gujarati Indian Americans sort of cheering Modi in a football stadium in Houston. But it's also the case, and I saw this from my own personal social media because I grew up in Houston, that many of those people's friends and relations and daughters and sons were out in front protesting or raising awareness about democratic backsliding in India and so on and so forth.
Milan, just, when we talk about Indian diaspora, we talk about how they have reached the highest echelons in the country, right? We talk about glory and success stories. Sundar Pichai, CEO of Google, Satya Nadella of Microsoft. We've had Ajay Banga and Indira Nooyi. And of course, we've had Vice President Kamala Harris, who's half Indian. We have the Samosa Caucus, right? We have 5 members of Congress of Indian origin. But there's also critique that the Indian Americans in Congress haven't been as vocal on Indian issues, or as compared to, say, some of the other communities. Say the Hispanic caucus communities have been able to coalesce better on issues pertaining to immigration. And there's also a sense that the Indian American in Congress perhaps sometimes have taken positions that are against India's foreign policy interests. We've seen how Congresswoman Jayapal and Foreign Minister Jaishankar butted heads on a Kashmir issue where the meeting was cancelled. I mean, I'm just curious what this perception of Indian Americans in Congress has been, or perhaps is there a curiosity or a tendency to overcorrect oneself and ergo the need to, push yourself further from India by taking positions that would affect the country back home just because of this new identity you've embraced? Is there something more telling in your study?
Well, I don't know if that's the case. I mean, so here's an interesting example, right? So India's second wave of the COVID crisis, the members of Congress who were amongst the most vocal that the Biden administration should do more in terms of sending oxygen and oxygen concentrators, do more in terms of excess doses of the vaccine, do more in terms of other forms of immediate relief, were, the names that come to mind are Pramila Jayapal and Ro Khanna, right, who are two progressive kind of liberal members of the House Democratic Caucus who are Indian American. And what's interesting about that is that those people, the particular Jayapal, have been vilified by some in India for being anti-India, right? Because of critical comments that she's made about domestic policy choices the Modi government has made. But they actually have been amongst the first to come to India's kind of aid and to raise awareness, right? So I think I think that's true, and I could think of other instances, whether it's Congressman Krishnamurthy or others. I mean, even Kamala Harris, despite getting some media flack for this, I think, has taken the time to talk not only to the diaspora, but also talk about the need to provide COVID assistance to India and so on and so forth. It's a small group, right? I mean, at the end of the day, there are limited numbers of members of Congress of Indian origin. I expect those numbers will increase. I think we know anecdotally that the numbers seem to be increasing when it goes to state legislators, right? State senates, state assemblies. And so I do think that there's a kind of pipeline being built all the way from national to kind of local politics. Now, It could also be the case, and I think this is again true of Indian Americans across the board, that you don't want to be known as a one-trick pony, right? You don't want to be known as only an advocate for a particular community. After all of the people we mentioned, while they may have large Indian or South Asian diaspora, you can't really rely on that alone from a voting standpoint, right? And so what's interesting is Dhrumil Mehta, who's a data scientist at 538, did a really interesting piece, which I'd encourage the people in this room to check out, looking at campaign finance data from Indian American congressional members. So people like Krishnamurthy, Yami Bera, Pramila Jayapal, and all. And what's interesting is that early on when they were getting their start, they all got a relatively big infusion of funds which came from other South Asian Americans that generally sort of tapered off, as they become better known, as they become incumbents, which I think, again, this sort of makes sense, right? I mean, like, you rally your community, they're the people who put you on the map, but then once you become known, you try to develop a kind of broader coalition. Now, I do think that there's a warning sign here, which is that there is a diversity of views in the Indian American diaspora. And if you look at, say, Sri Preston Kulkarni's example, he's somebody who, as a Democrat, he ran twice for the Texas 22, which is a congressional district.
Your home state.
My home state, and actually the constituency where my parents now live. It's not the one I grew up in, but it's now where they moved to. And there was actually many stories done looking at how the South Asian diaspora was not uniformly behind him, right? Because there were people who felt that he had been too uncritical of Modi. There were people who were upset that he took money from people who have alleged RSS links to kind of Hindu nationalist organizations. And on the other side, there were people who felt like he didn't bask in his Indianness enough, right? And that he tried to kind of keep a distance. So I think it's very hard to kind of walk that line. And again, I come back to the fact that, these are themes that could be explored really in any immigrant population, that particularly one of this size. At the end of the day, Indian Americans are 1% of the U.S. population, right? And I think we have to keep that in mind.
Milan, there's a very intriguing point. I think sometimes some of the coverage in India perhaps incorrectly paints this, creates this Manichaean duopoly of like for like, assuming like, left of center in the US and right of center in the US is left of center in India and right of center in India, such as Democrats and Congress and Republicans and BJP, and Trump is good for India and Biden not good for India. And I just find that misses the forest for the trees on so many levels, right? Because my umbrage for that is these are very different systems and different structures, different politics, and countries which are in very different stages. So you could be an immigrant in America and vote differently in America, care about certain values that affect you as an immigrant, and feel differently about the issues back in India and vote a different way, because inherently we're not the same people in two different ways, be it at times hypocritical, but largely that's just the way people think about themselves. I mean, there is a sense of altruism, but there's also a sense of self-servingness, because a lot of politics is self-serving. A lot of voters do vote on issues that they personally identify with, right? And so just walk me through how we miss the forest for the trees sometimes by just equating these big tent politics for Indian structures, right?
One of the things we tried to do is to try to understand people's policy preferences in India and how they might compare to the United States, right? And so kind of one way of doing that is to try to ask them about similar, examples of certain, say, democratic norms or policies, and then try to compare their responses in different settings, right? So asking, say, about affirmative action, asking about media censorship, asking about the appropriateness of the use of force by police on peaceful protesters, right? Things of that nature. And I think there's kind of a couple of big takeaways, right? So one is that if you ask about how people feel about these issues in the abstract, how important is it to treat members of all religious groups equally? Should there be more permissive policies towards undocumented immigrants? Should there be affirmative action in university admissions, right? Large majorities say yes, right? So everyone is kind of liberal in the abstract. Then you ask them the question later on with a U.S. example, right? So do you support President Trump's 2017 Muslim ban? Should race be considered a factor in higher education admissions in the United States, right? Is it okay for the Trump administration to retaliate against media reporters who are critical of them? And you see that a slightly smaller percentage, but still pretty high percentages of Indian Americans kind of agree with the more liberal perspective. And then you ask the same set of questions in an Indian context, right? So incorporating things like NRC, incorporating media freedom issues, incorporating, how the police treated Anti-Citizenship Act protesters last year. And you find a slightly more conservative views, right? So very liberal in the abstract, a little bit less liberal in the U.S. context, and even less liberal or more conservative in the Indian context. And, we can't definitively say why this is the case, but our speculation is, and it seems plausible, is that where you sit is where you stand, right? Indian Americans are a distinct minority. Hindus make up the largest segment of Indian Americans, about 55%. But, it's 55% of a pretty small number. And so they have that conditions how they look at policy questions here. Indian Americans, if you kind of plop them down in India, particularly Hindus, who are a majority, right, tend to look at things sort of differently, right? So it's not necessarily cognitive dissonance. It's just that, people can hold different policy preferences and political perspectives depending on the context, right? Amongst the diaspora, the BJP is much more popular than the Congress, right? We think of the BJP traditionally as a more right-of-center party. At the same time, the Democratic Party still remains the most popular choice for Indian Americans, right? Which we think of as a left-of-center party. So I think there is a puzzle there, but I think part of it is the kind of, where you sit is where you stand. And that really does shape your policy preferences, and they can be different in different contexts.
And with that, we bring this episode to a close. If you like what you're hearing, kindly give us a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell a friend. So until next time, on The Global Detail. This podcast has been a production of Karkata Media in association with Perspicacity Media LLC. All guest views are their own. If you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns, email us at globaldetailpodcast@gmail.com, or you can contact us on Facebook and Twitter at Global Detail Pod. This recording, or any portion thereof, may not be reproduced or used in any manner whatsoever without the express written permission of the publisher, except for the use of brief quotations in a review. Copyright 2022 by Karkata Media LLC. All rights reserved.